The day was gray, not just a cloud-covered sky or the faint drizzle of rain. No, it was the kind of gray that settled deep into your bones, wrapping around your heart like a suffocating blanket. The world felt still, holding its breath as Lily stood in front of her mother's casket. The air was thick with the stench of sadness, sorrow, and a sense of finality. Today, her mother, Claire, was supposed to be gone forever. It was hard to imagine that just 2 weeks ago, Lily had been talking to her mother on the phone. Her voice as clear and familiar as always. Claire had been feeling unwell, but Lily never thought it would lead to this. Her mother's sudden passing from what doctors believed was a heart attack. But now, here she was, surrounded by mourners, standing in front of her mother's casket, clutching a small bouquet of white roses. Lily had always imagined her mother's funeral would be a day of quiet reflection, but it felt like something else was lurking in the shadows. Something she couldn't put her finger on. Lily tried to steady her trembling hands as she placed the flowers atop the casket. The solemn faces around her blurred, her thoughts clouded by the image of her mother, lying motionless in a hospital bed just days before, the life drained from her body. The whole thing seemed unreal, like a bad dream she couldn't wake up from. Her best friend Emma had arrived early to support her, standing at her side with a comforting hand on Lily's shoulder. But even Emma seemed distant today, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of pity and fear, as if they were all waiting for something. "I can't believe she's really gone," Lily whispered, her voice barely above a breath. She didn't even know what she was hoping for anymore. A sign, a feeling, something to make it all seem less absurd. The mourners slowly made their way to the front, paying their respects. But Lily remained frozen in place, her gaze fixed on the casket. Her mother's favorite flowers, lilies, adorned the edges, and there were the personal touches Claire had insisted on for years. Lilies, the scent of lavender, and a soft pink ribbon that she had chosen for her wedding day decades ago. She thought about how much her mother had always adored flowers, how her eyes lit up every spring when the first blossoms bloomed. And now, all that was left was this empty shell, surrounded by a sea of flowers and the haunting silence of finality. Lily's mind raced. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. There was something off about all of this, but she couldn't quite explain it. Something didn't add up, and Lily wasn't sure what it was. But the feeling grew stronger as the day went on. It was the funeral director, Mr. Williams, who spoke to her next, his voice low and steady. "The service will begin shortly, Miss Lily. Is there anything I can do to help?" His words were gentle, but they did little to calm her racing thoughts. She nodded, trying to pull herself together. "None. I'm fine. Thank you, Mr. Williams." Emma squeezed her shoulder one last time before heading to the front of the chapel. Lily remained rooted to the spot, staring at the polished wood of the casket. And then, just as she was about to turn away, something caught her eye. A small detail that shouldn't have mattered, but somehow it did. The clasp on the coffin lid was slightly out of alignment. She felt a shiver run down her spine. Lily quickly turned her head, almost laughing at herself for being so paranoid. She had just watched too many crime documentaries, that was all. But the thought wouldn't leave her. She glanced back at the casket, and for a split second, she thought she saw a flicker of movement. Her heart skipped a beat. Part 2, The Discovery. Lily forced herself to breathe slowly. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself. But as the service began, and the mourners stood to speak their final words, she couldn't shake the strange feeling of unease gnawing at her. The whole room seemed to blur around her, the words of the eulogy floating past her ears like a distant echo. As the ceremony ended, Lily was escorted to the back room where the family could wait before the burial. Her mind was racing. What had she seen? The clasp, the flicker of movement. It couldn't be. But the nagging thought refused to leave her, curling around her like a dark cloud. "Lily, you okay?" Emma's voice pulled her back to reality. Lily forced a smile, trying to push the feeling aside. "Yeah, just tired. It's been a long day." Emma looked at her with concern but didn't push the issue. The two of them sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, each lost in their own thoughts. But Lily couldn't focus. She kept replaying the moment in her mind. The flicker of movement. The thought of her mother lying still in that casket made her heart ache. But something wasn't right. She stood up suddenly, a decision forming in her mind. "I need to go back to the chapel," she muttered, more to herself than to Emma. I'll be right back. Before Emma could protest, Lily was already on her way out, pushing through the heavy wooden doors of the back room and into the dimly lit corridor. She moved quickly, almost on instinct, her feet carrying her toward the chapel where her mother's body lay. As she entered the chapel, the air felt thicker, colder. The mourners had mostly gone, leaving the room eerily quiet, with only the soft hum of distant voices from outside. Lily's heart pounded as she approached the casket, the uneasy feeling growing stronger with every step. The coffin stood there, unchanged, but the clasp was still slightly askew. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She moved closer, her fingers trembling as they reached for the edge of the lid. It seemed impossible, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The lid of the casket was heavy, cold beneath her hands, but it wasn't locked. In a flash of panic, she pulled the lid open just a few inches. Her heart seemed to stop. There, beneath the satin lining, was her mother. Or at least, it looked like her. But Lily's blood ran cold as she looked closer. Her mother's fingers were twitching, just slightly. The hair stood up on the back of her neck. No, this couldn't be happening. Part 3. The reveal. Her hands froze, unable to move. A mixture of shock, confusion, and disbelief flooded through her. The woman in the casket appeared lifeless, but those fingers, twitching slightly, were undeniable. It was impossible. Her mother was dead. The doctor said she was dead, but Lily couldn't tear her eyes away from the small, almost imperceptible movement. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. But no, this was real. Without thinking, Lily reached forward, her pulse racing in her ears as she placed her fingers gently on her mother's cold skin. The sensation was unlike anything she could have imagined. Her mother's skin was cold and unyielding at first, but when Lily touched her wrist, a slight pulse throbbed under her fingertips. Her entire body went rigid and her mind raced. Her mother wasn't dead. She wasn't dead. The thought was so terrifying, so unbelievable, that Lily couldn't process it for a moment. The air around her seemed to grow even colder, and Lily stumbled back, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. She had to be dreaming. There was no way her mother was alive after what they had all seen. But she couldn't deny it. Then, the unthinkable happened. Her mother's eyes fluttered open. Lily staggered back, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might explode. The world seemed to spin around her as her mother's eyes, those familiar, kind eyes, slowly focused on her. Claire's mouth moved, but the words were faint, a whisper caught in a dying breath. Lily couldn't understand what she was hearing, but it didn't matter. Her mother was alive. After all this time, after everything, Claire was alive. Lily gasped, her hand shaking as she reached out for her mother's hand. Mom, are you? The words caught in her throat, but her mother's hand tightened around hers, and with a raspy, desperate voice, Claire whispered, "Help me." Part 4. The escape. Lily's heart raced as she clutched her mother's hand, panic flooding her. She wasn't sure if it was the shock of the moment or something else entirely, but Claire's eyes were filled with fear. Fear Lily had never seen before. "Mom, what's happening? How are you alive? How did I was..." Claire's voice trailed off. Weak and strained, she gasped for air, but her grip on Lily tightened. Her fingers were cold but strong, as if she was still fighting something. "They thought I was dead," Claire muttered, her eyes darting around the room. They put me in the coffin, but I'm not dead. I can't let them find me." Who did this to you?" Lily's voice was trembling now, desperate. Claire's eyes flickered, filled with fear and regret. "They're coming." "They'll come for me again. For both of us. You have to leave. Now." Lily's pulse quickened as the urgency in her mother's voice sank in. She looked at the door, knowing something. Someone was on the other side. She could hear footsteps, faint but unmistakable, getting closer. "Mom, I won't leave you," Lily cried out, her eyes wide with panic. "I don't have time to explain," Claire said, her voice frantic. "They'll..." Suddenly, the chapel door swung open with a loud bang, and 2 figures stepped inside. The world seemed to stop. Part 5. The final revelation. Lily's blood ran cold as she faced the men. One of them was tall, with dark, cold eyes that seemed to pierce through her very soul. The other was smaller but equally menacing, his posture rigid and dangerous. "Miss Lily," the tall man said, his voice calm but filled with threat. You should have stayed away. This has gone on long enough." Lily's mind raced. Who were these people? What did they want? Claire's grip tightened on her hand. "Go," she whispered urgently. "They'll kill you too if you stay. Please." The two men slowly advanced, their faces devoid of emotion. Claire's eyes narrowed, and in a swift motion, she reached inside the casket, pulling out a hidden weapon. A small, sleek device that clicked into place in her hand. The taller man raised an eyebrow but didn't flinch. "You think you can stop us?" "I don't think so," Claire responded, her voice steady despite the panic in her eyes. The room seemed to shrink, the tension so thick it was suffocating. The men took another step forward. "You have no idea what's at stake, do you?" The smaller man sneered, his eyes flicking between Lily and Claire. Suddenly, the doors slammed shut. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. Claire stood, her hand gripping the weapon, ready for whatever would come next. "Lily," Claire whispered, "run. Go now. I'll hold them off." But before Lily could react, the men lunged, and the sound of their footsteps echoed in the chapel as the chase began. The truth was out, and the fight for survival was far from over. Lily ran, and as the door slammed behind her, she knew her life had just become